Welcome students. This is the third session of your ratio analysis. So last class we discussed completely about your liquidity ratio. As we know, there are four types of ratios. One is liquidity ratio, solvency ratio, activity ratio, and profitability ratio. So all together is known as all together is the steps or the tools for your ratio analysis. So last class we discussed about your liquidity ratio. Under this liquidity ratio, there were three ratios. One is about your current ratio, liquidity ratio, another one absolute liquidity ratio, or this can be called as your acid test ratio, or it can be called as your quick ratio also. Now in this session, let us discuss about your solvency ratio. In this solvency ratio, there are four types of ratios. So before that, let us discuss what do you mean by solvency ratio. So here normally it tells about your, it measures the extent to which asset cover commitments for future payments. So for future payments commitments, so we guys going to measure the solvency ratio. There are four types of ratios. As I said, one will be a debt equity ratio. First one as debt equity ratio, and second one as proprietary ratio, and next total asset or total assets to debt ratio, and finally we guys going to look about your interest coverage ratio. So these are the four types of ratios. So first one will be as debt equity ratio, next proprietary ratio, another one total assets to debt ratio, and last one that is interest coverage ratio. So first let us discuss about your debt equity ratio. So what is debt equity ratio? It's so simple. It states that it indicating the relative proportion of shareholders. So normally it depends on your shareholders equity and debt used to finance a. Now let us discuss the debt equity ratio. So what is debt equity ratio? First, let us know the meaning of that. It indicating the relative proportion between the shareholders and debt used to the finance of a company asset. So how we guys use these sources of funds towards your assets in the organization or in the company. So the formula states that debt divided by equity, or the another formula, this will be a standard formula where we guys going to keep on using, that is long-term debts or loans divided by shareholders fund or net worth. This will be standard formula where we guys going to look into your problems. And the next second one, that is about your proprietary. The second formula, that is about your proprietary ratio. So this is simple. Equity ratio is a general indicator of financial stability. In order to know your financial stability, we guys going to use this proprietary ratio. The formula is the proprietary ratio, which equals to shareholders fund divided by total assets. So total assets, which indicates the two things. One is about your fixed assets, another one is current assets. And the third one, that's all about your total assets to debt ratio. So here it tells you the percentage of a company, the total assets that were financed by the creditors. Make sure the total assets in your company that which are financed by the creditors. In order to know that, we guys going to calculate your total assets to debt ratio. The formula states that so simple, that is total assets divided by debts. So what are the debts divided, the total assets divided by total debts. And the next one, as you are the last one, the interest coverage ratio, ICR, that is interest coverage ratio. Why we need to calculate this? Particularly we need to calculate because it is used to determine how easily a company can pay their interest expenses on outstanding debt. With the help of outstanding debt, how easily you people can pay your interest. So that's the main motive to calculate your interest coverage ratio. The formula says that earnings before interest and tax, that is EBIT. As you people know that you might have solved this problem on your financial management subject, or in the last sessions where we, in the compare common size or comparative or the trend, we have calculated the EBIT or the net profit. That's about your earnings before interest and tax. So earnings before interest and tax divided by fixed interest charges. So this was the simple formula. So IC, that means interest coverage ratio, which gives the value, in order to identify that, EBIT divided by fixed interest charges. Now let us look into your problem. This is the simple problem what I said. This can appear for your 6 marks. In the second step, that is solvency ratio, here we guys going to take care only about your total assets along with your long-term debt and equity share capital. Now, from the following, let us calculate debt equity ratio, proprietor ratio, and total assets to debt ratio. Now, this is what the things what they have given. Now, that can be in your vertical format or it can be in your horizontal format. That is liabilities as well as assets. Now, the liabilities hand side they have mentioned equity share capital. Another one as general reserve, creditors, and long-term loan. Equity share capital is 4 lakh, general reserve is 1 lakh, creditors 50,000, long-term loan 1 lakh 50. The total of that 7 lakh. Next, come to your asset side. In the assets, there are a mixture of two things, that is about your fixed asset as well as current asset. That is stock 1 lakh, land and building 2 lakh, plant and machinery 3 lakh, cash 1 lakh. The total of that is same as it is 7 lakh. Now we need to classify. As I said, there are three aspects. As I said, in the liability side there are three aspects where we need to divide the content, and in the asset side there are only two things. So one is, first, under the liability side there are three aspects. So one is shareholders fund, another one long term debt, and last one current liability. And in your current or in your asset side there are two things. One is your non-current assets, or that can be called as a fixed assets, another one as current assets. These are the five aspects where we need to divide. Already in the first step we have considered the current liabilities as well as the current assets, but in this step, in the liabilities hand side, we guys going to ignore your current liability and we will consider only your shareholders fund and long-term debt. But when it comes to your asset side, two things also will be considered. That's what we will call it as total assets. Two things also will be considered, that is called as your total assets. Now let us solve the calculation of solvency ratio. Under that, the first one is your debt equity ratio. Debt equity ratio, in order to calculate this, there's a certain formula. As I said, the formula states that in the debt equity ratio, as we know, there are two formulas. One is debt equity or debt divided by equity, or long-term debts or loans divided by shareholders fund, or that can be called as net worth. Now in this formula we guys going to use, the formula states that long-term loan or long-term debts divided by shareholders fund. Now we need to know which are the long-term debts over here. So the long-term debts, which includes only the one, that is the long-term loan, and these two things, that means equity share capital, general reserve. There, as I said, there are three classifications. One is about your shareholders fund, long-term debt, another one current liability. Equity share capital as well as general reserve, two things also is known as your shareholders fund, and long-term loan, which includes about your it includes under your long-term debt, and the creditors, which includes your current liability. But here we guys going to ignore your current liability. We need to consider only your shareholders fund, another one as long-term debt. In this question they said long-term debt divided by, or in order to identify your debt equity ratio, the formula states long-term debt divided by shareholders fund. So which is the long-term debt? The only one, that is about your 1,50,000. So long-term debt is 1,50,000. But when it comes to shareholders fund, there are two things. One is equity share capital, that is rupees 4 lakh, and another one the general reserve, that is rupees 1 lakh. So hence 4 lakh plus 1 lakh, so which gives the value as 1,50,000 divided by 5 lakh. The total shareholders fund is how much? That is just 5 lakh. So hence your debt equity ratio is 0.3. Hence your debt equity ratio will be as 0.3. The next we guys going to look into your first, they said debt equity ratio we have calculated as 0.3. Next let us look into your proprietary ratio. In order to calculate your proprietary ratio, the formula states shareholders fund divided by total asset. Shareholders fund divided by total asset. As we know already, we have calculated the shareholders fund, that is how much? 4 lakh plus 1 lakh, the value is 5 lakh rupees. Now let us take into consideration the shareholders fund as rupees 5 lakh. But now we need to know the total asset. The total asset, which it's a mix of your fixed assets as well as current assets. Make sure very particular in the out of these 5 classifications, already current liability and current assets we have used for first calculation, that means liquidity ratio or liquid ratio. But in this statement we guys, or in order to calculate your solvency ratios, we guys going to ignore only the current liability. Clear? But we will consider your current assets. So including your fixed assets plus current assets is known as your total asset. Now stock, land and building, plant and machinery, cash, including all these 4, the value of your asset is how much? 7 lakh. Hence the total assets value is 7 lakh. Now proprietary ratio, which gives the value as 5 lakh divided by 7 lakh, that is 0.71. Now so this is what your value of your proprietary ratio or general indicator of financial situation. The third calculation, that's all about your total asset or total assets to debt ratio. The formula itself the word itself states total assets to debt ratio. The formula will be indicates as total assets divided by debts. Now what about your total assets? As we have mentioned already, that is about your including your fixed assets as well as current assets. So total of assets is how much? 7 lakh divided by, now we don't know the debt. So what is debt? So debt, it indicates only about your long-term debts. The long-term debts, the total long-term debts is how much? 1,50,000. Only the long-term debt will be known as your debts. Hence total assets debt equity or debt ratio, which gives the value as 4.67. So hence this the value is known as your, where the percentage of the company total assets that were financial by creditors, the 4.67 times the your financial are by creditors. So this is what the total calculation of your solvency ratio. There are, as I said, there are 3 things. One is debt equity ratio, proprietary ratio, another one total asset to debt ratio. Now let us look into the second problem. In this problem again we need to calculate the debt equity ratio, proprietary ratio, another one as total assets to debt or debt ratio. Here there are 2 things what they have classified, that is as your liabilities and the one as your assets. Now in this problem they have mentioned about your equity share capital, preference share capital, reserves and surplus, debentures, bank loan, and when it comes to your asset side, land and building, plant and machinery, furniture, cash, debtors, another one as discount on issue shareholders fund. This is what the discount which has been provided. So it's one of your miscellaneous expenditure where we guys going to treat. Now as I said, the liability side, there are 3 things where it should be classified. One is as your shareholders fund, another one long-term debt, another one as current liability. But we guys going to ignore the current liability. In this question they have not mentioned about your current liability, so hence we guys going to nothing to worry about that. Next, when it comes here land and building, plant and machinery, furniture, when the asset side, here we guys go, as I said, there are two things. One is your fixed assets, another one as current assets. Together is known as your total asset. Now, the only thing, this was the total assets, so we need not to worry about this. So let us classify the items of your liabilities and side. We need to classify as your shareholders fund, long-term debt, only two things. So your equity share capital, preference share capital, reserves and surplus, which comes under your shareholders fund. Next, debentures, another one as bank loan. This is what your long-term debts, that means it's your term loans. Now let us calculate the first one as debtors or debt equity ratio. So debt equity ratio comes under your solvency ratio. So take down the heading as calculation of solvency ratio. Under this, let us calculate the first one as your debt equity ratio. As we know the formula, that is long-term debts or loans divided by shareholders fund. Long-term debts divided by shareholders fund. Now let us classify the items that as long-term, another one as long-term debts, another one as shareholders fund. So in this there are two aspects, as we know, debentures, another one as bank loan. The debentures, the value is known as your 2 lakh rupees. Another one, the bank loan, 1,50,000. Together 3,50,000 is your long term debt. Under shareholders fund, there are three things as we know. One is equity share capital, preference share capital, reserves and surplus. The total of this is 6 lakh. The total of all the shareholders fund is your 6 lakh. But this is not your total shareholders fund. Why? Because in the asset side they are said, while issuing the, or there was a discount on issue of shareholders fund. On this overall issues there was an 50,000 rupees discount. So hence minus that 50,000 as your discount, minus this value as your discount on shareholders fund, that is rupees 50,000. So hence 6 lakh minus 50,000, total shareholders fund is how much now? That is as your 5,50,000. Now we know the two things. Long term debt is how much? 3,50,000 and shareholders fund is 5,50,000. Now long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Long term debt is 3,50,000 divided by shareholders fund is 5,50,000. So if we divide this, the value will be debtors equity ratio. The value as where we guys going to get in this problem, that is 0.64. The second step, proprietary ratio. In this, the formula as we know, shareholders fund divided by total assets. So already shareholders fund where we have calculated, that is 5,50,000. Now what about your total assets? So total assets, which includes your fixed assets along with your current asset. So all this together where we guys going to consider your total asset. Now as we know, all this together where the value will be as rupees 10 lakh. 10 lakh where land and building 2,50,000, plant and machinery 2,50,000, furniture 50,000, cash 2,50,000, debtors 1,50,000 and discount on issue shareholders fund, that was as 50,000. All this together is known as your total asset. The total asset is value is 10 lakh rupees. Now as we know, the shareholders fund was 5,50,000 and hence now total asset was 10 lakh rupees. So hence 5,50,000 divided by 10 lakh, the value will gives you as, where we guys going to see as 0.55. Next, the third calculation, it's all about your, the third calculation, that's about total asset, that shows the total assets to debt ratio. The formula states that total assets divided by debt ratio. So as we know, the total assets already we have considered that as rupees 10 lakh, take down as it is the same. But debt ratio, in this debt ratio is nothing that the value of your bank loan along with your debentures, that means the long term debt. The debt ratio which includes your long, only we guys going to consider the long term debt, that is 2 lakh plus 1,50,000, totally 3,50,000. Now 10 lakh divided by 3,50,000, which gives the value as 2.857. This is what your complete problem on solvency ratio. In the next session, let us discuss about your the next step that's known as your activity ratio. Now let me explain one problem completely about your solvency ratio. So as we know, solvency ratio, it's all about your the sources which invested on your assets, where we guys going to see. Now the content of your liabilities as well as assets, we guys going to divide it into your 5 aspects. One is shareholders fund, long term debt, current liability. Another one, fixed assets as well as current assets, that is known as your total asset. But in this problem, we guys going to consider only 4 things. That's what: shareholders fund, long term debt, fixed assets as well as current assets. Here we will ignore current liability because this will never, this already we are checked into your liquidity ratio. Now there are four types of calculation, but in this problem we have seen only the discussed only the 3 types. That's all about your debt equity ratio, proprietary ratio, total assets to debt ratio. Now debt equity ratio, in order to calculate this, there's a certain formula: long term debt divided by shareholders fund. So as I said, we need to classify the items. The long term debts, which are the long term debts? That is term loans, where debentures, another one as bank loan. And shareholders fund is known as your equity share capital, another one as preference share capital, and reserves and surplus. But in this problem, we have provided the discount on issue of shareholders fund. So hence we have provided the discount, so we guys going to minus that. This is known as your miscellaneous expenditure. Now the total long-term debt was 3,50,000 and the total shareholders fund was 5,50,000. So hence 3,50,000 divided by 5,50,000, which gives the value as your 0.64. Next, the second step we guys going to look into that is proprietary ratio. Proprietary ratio, the formula is shareholders fund divided by total assets. The shareholders fund, already as I said, after deducting your discount, the value was 5,50,000. The same 5,50,000 where we have considered as your shareholders fund, and the total assets. The total assets, which includes your fixed assets along with your current assets, that is rupees 10 lakh. So proprietary ratio will be as 5,50,000 divided by 10 lakh. Hence your value will be 0.55. Next step, that's about your total assets to debt ratio. The total assets to debt ratio is nothing that about your long-term debt we are speaking here. So total assets is known as your 10 lakh as we consider, because it's a mixture of your fixed assets as well as current assets, and divided by debt ratio. Debt ratio, as I said, it is known as your long-term debt. We need to consider only your long-term debt. So which are the long-term debts? There are 2 things. One is debentures 2 lakh, bank loan is 1,50,000. So hence that is your 3,50,000. Now total assets is 10 lakh divided by debt ratio, that means long-term debt is about your 3,50,000. Finally, your total assets to debt ratio is how much? 2.857. In the next session, let us discuss about your the next step, that is activity ratio. Thank you.